Just having the ability to have both of you having to listen to me without interruption, that's good enough reason to be here. Aluf and I worked together for many years, and I spent some time in Washington when Dennis was still in office, maybe.
I was in office for a long time.
No, for a long time, yeah. So I'll try. Yeah, I'll try not to talk too much about the politics of the day, among other things, because I think we are today at a time in which separating the signal from the noise is just very difficult. There is a new government in Israel. There is a lot of noise, and I'm not yet sure what's going to come out of all of this. And hence, I will not talk about the judicial reform or all the other things. I'll try to look more broadly at U.S.-Israel relations and just remark on a few points. I'll begin with an article I read this morning by a wonderful man, Avi Gil. He wrote an article from Ariv. I'm not sure if you're going to mention your article, but in this article, Avi Gil recommended. You haven't read it yet. Okay, it's not bad. A good editor would make it even better, but it's not bad. So Avi recommends to the Jews of North America to get used to what Israel is rather than hope for what they want Israel to be. And I would take this argument and expand it and say, well, this is an argument that works not just for the Jews of North America, it works for all Americans. Israel is what it is. You can like it or dislike it, you can agree with it or disagree with it, you can fight for changing it, but it is what it is. And whatever is going to be the relationship between Israel and the United States in the coming years or decades, it's going to be with the real America and the real Israel. It cannot be with an imaginary Israel or a hoped for Israel. It must be with the Israel that we have. And it's far from perfect, and it's worrying in many ways. And there are many trends with which that I find worrying or troubling. But that's the country in which I live in, and I must recognize the fact that relationships between countries are the result of the societies that live in these countries. And I also must recognize the fact that societies do not change because of foreign relations. If anyone expects Israeli society or Israeli trends to be altered because of the warnings of experts about the future of Israeli-America relations, that's not going to happen. Countries tend to exhaust all possible pathways to resist outside pressure before they change as a result of outside pressure. And I would argue that Israel is probably going to continue on the trajectory that its society would like to pursue, even if that's not what Americans would like to see here. So that's my first point. Israel is Israel. Let's not hope for Israel to change because of the U.S.-Israel relations. Second point, we tend to focus, well, we sit in Israel today and we tend to focus on Israel, but America is also changing. And it is changing in many different ways, some of which are also troubling. And when we speak about U.S.-Israel relations, well, the relations between Israel and America of the 8 Obama years, or the relations of Israel and America in the 4 Donald Trump years, or the 4 Joe Biden years, or maybe 8. Who knows what's going to happen after these years? America is going through many social, religious, demographic changes these will alter not just the character of Israel, but also the character of the United States, its ambitions, its morals, its values, and many other things that we can not yet foresee. And we must keep this in mind as we, as Israelis, look at ourselves and say, okay, how can we better behave to better fit our need for good relations with the United States? We must not forget that America is changing in parallel to the changes here, and we must consider the changes overseas as well. Point number 3, focusing on Israel and the United States is also a mistake, because there is a world beyond Israel and the United States. Israel-US relations are never just a result of what happens in Israel and the United States. It's a result of what happens at the larger geopolitical sphere. The relations between the US and China are as important to US-Israel relations as the government of Israel, and maybe even more so. You cannot imagine the history of US-Israel relations without the Cold War. The Cold War was as dramatic and as influential on these relations as the shared values, or the governments of Israel, or the differences between administrations in the United States. The fact of the Cold War is probably one, if not the most important factor in the development of US-Israel relations. And if the world is going to go through another Cold War type relations between the US and China, or anything else that we can imagine in the geopolitical sphere, this is going to have huge impact on US-Israel relations, disregarding the governments that are going to rule Israel in the coming years. Point number, I lost count. 4. Point number 4. So now I'm going to say something somewhat controversial, and there's a little apprehension on my part because Dennis is sitting here, and he spoke eloquently about the shared values, and he wrote eloquently about the shared values in his book. Did you mention your book? You should read his book, Doomed to Succeed. So it's. I'm not trying to. I'm not going to argue with what he said, but I am going to say that the story of shared values is a nice story that we tell ourselves, and to some extent it's even true. But it is not the crucial factor in the US-Israel relations. Some history was mentioned here. When President Kennedy decided to sell Israel the Hawk missiles in the early 60s, this was not because of shared values. This was because of the interest of the United States in the Middle East, because of the US relations with Egypt, because of the Cold War that I already mentioned. I'm not saying shared values did not play a role, but they certainly did not play the most important or the most crucial role. So we must not forget that having shared values is a great addition to the mix. But the US and Saudi Arabia are working together without having shared values. And it's not as if I want Israel to become Saudi Arabia. Make no mistake, I would like Israel to remain a Jewish and democratic state, and liberal and pluralistic state. But I do not want to make the shared values as if this is a make or break thing for the US-Israel relations. We mentioned Doomed to Succeed, Dennis's book. I hope you'll forgive me for mentioning another book. There's a new book by Walter Russell Mead, which I'm sure you already read, The Ark of a Covenant. It's called. I highly recommend it, and I would like to use it by way of reminding ourselves how little we know about the future. One of the most intriguing points that Mead makes in his book, he basically argues that the most important thing the US ever did for Israel was to pass legislation against new immigrants in the 1920s. 1924, the United States is in a mood of not accepting more immigrants, Poles, Italians, Catholics, Jews. So they closed the gates. The closing of the gates, which had awful results for the Jewish people, because we know what happened later in the 30s and the 40s, also forced on the Jewish people to enhance and redouble their efforts in fulfilling the Zionist dream. America was no longer a real option for Jews. And hence the result of the most dramatic, draconic, some would say reprehensible act by the United States in the 90s ended up helping create the state of Israel in the late 40s. And I'm mentioning this story because it is important to be reminded that we know very little about the future, and we know very little about the way our actions today will influence the result of tomorrow or the day after tomorrow. So this is not a call on my part for the United States to, again, act harshly against Israel in the hope that the result will be better for Israel in the future. But it is a call to refrain, or at least be careful when we voice harsh predictions for the future of the U.S.-Israel relations, when we pretend to know that trends in Israel and in the United States today are necessarily going to lead to doom, gloom, and a problematic future for the relations or for any of these two countries. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you, Shmuel. At this point, we'd like to open up the